All right. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending where you are. My name is Nikki Gable. I am a program manager here at Michigan Public Health Institute. We are so grateful for your time today and very excited to be able to dive into a really important presentation as we talk about policies. But first, I would love to say thank you for all of our partners who are joining today from around the country who are doing this work around recovery-friendly workplaces. Also, want to thank all of those that have become designated who are joining today, whether you're designated as a Michigan recovery-friendly workplace or as another state's recovery-friendly workplace. Just thank you for taking the extra time to learn a little bit more today about policies. I'm going to do a very quick overview of what it means for us here in Michigan to be a recovery-friendly workplace. So, give you a quick overview here. We're going to dive into some policies, and obviously that is why we're here and why we need to really focus on what policies are in place. We're going to get a good deep dive into the whys and the hows and future conversation as well. We'll talk about some key legal trends impacting employers and employees, learn about how to be consistent in recovery-friendly approaches, and identify some real-life examples that we have the expert who is going to really share all that important information with us. But before we go forward, we want to level set because we do know some folks here are either A, new to this discussion, B, wanting to learn a little bit more about this. And it's really important that we level set and understand why we're here and why we're doing this here in Michigan as well. So, first and foremost, we really want to describe what substance use disorder is, and that is a treatable chronic medical disease involving in complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. And there's a lot of individuals, 48.4 million US individuals have a substance use disorder. We don't talk about it enough, and that's why we're really trying to bring it to our employers today. In 2024, over 29 million Americans were employed. And one important piece is that we don't think about that aspect when we're thinking about substance use disorder necessarily. So we really have a lot of work to do in terms of bringing it to the workplace. There's a lot of stigma around it. And so this middle, square here talking about substance use disorder that is not a moral failing, it's not a choice, it's not a lack of willpower, and that it is a disease. And so when we're approaching a lot of these conversations, we have to think about that aspect of it as well. And that recovery from substance use disorder is a process of change. Support is really important around that recovery process. And a lot of folks have reached recovery. 23.5 million Americans aged 18 and older are in recovery from some form of substance use disorder. And because we're talking about workplaces, we really wanted to demonstrate the different occupations and industries that are impacted by substance use disorder. You can see that pretty much every industry that you can imagine or occupation that you can imagine is represented here. We can see that there are some occupations are definitely more impacted than others. And, construction is definitely one of those we hear a lot about that are really impacted by substance use disorder. There's also, when we think about all of these different occupations and industries that are impacted, we kind of have to think about, okay, so why should workplaces get involved? And only 1 in 5 people who need treatment receive it. And there's a lot of different reasons why that is. Some of it is a fact of stigma and shame that might be associated with people don't want to talk about it. There is so much work to be done in this space, and employers really have an outstanding opportunity to really make and remove those barriers. So we think about on the left side, we have some of the reasons why individuals don't receive treatment. On the right, how workplaces can kind of dive into this a little bit. So we can reduce the stigma and shame by providing that safe space for others to feel safe seeking support. Another really big aspect is lack of access to care, and some of that is just knowing what is available. And again, employers have an opportunity to really demonstrate what resources are available, and we can help in that way by really talking about it and sharing with employers, sharing with managers and staff exactly what resources are available in their neck of the woods. There's a lot of fear of legal and employment consequences. We'll dive into a little bit over that over the next three, days of talking about policies. But we can also start to change that by changing the policies we have or improving, discussing, bringing forward what policies could be are important to have in place to support the employees in this space. Access to resources, we've talked about that. Belief they can handle alone is another reason people don't receive treatment, and mental health and co-occurring disorders. There's a lot that goes into having substance use disorder and recovery. And we really want to set up a space in the employment setting to be able to remove those barriers in any way that we can. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but we talk about this in the recovery from the workplace settings quite a bit. Um, so we kind of talked about the stats, but there's also, it's good for business, really diving into this. And employees in recovery save employers an average of $8,500 annually. A lot of that is avoiding those turnover costs and replacement and healthcare costs. We also really want to bring forward that an individual who is in recovery, they have learned so much and they have so much to be able to bring to the workforce that is unique and important. They're dedicated, motivated workers. So this is a big piece to that journey as well. And having a job is really part of that recovery process, but having all of that history, all that background really brings all of that to the job and to the workforce as well. Dedicated employers, workers in recovery miss 13.7 fewer days each year than workers with an untreated SUD, 3.6 less days than an average employee. They want to be at work, and that supportive environment keeps people coming back, no matter what their journey is. So, what is a recovery friendly workplace? Just really quick, before we turn this over, it is a workplace where employers and employees intentionally work together to create policies, practices, and culture that support employees who are in recovery from or who are affected by a substance use disorder. And they do that in many different ways, but the biggest piece is really trying to build that supportive environment, thinking about prevention opportunities. What is the risk within our employment setting and how can we reduce that? Really training staff talking about substance use disorder and opioid use disorder, thinking about our policies again. We're going to dive in, hiring policies, supportive employment policies and practices to support employees and the employer, and ensuring employees have access to treatment and recovery support. Here in Michigan, we have a process. We are really working with employers through training. We have a three-part training series. Many of those who are here and are already designated as recovery friendly workplace have gone through this process. We train them on stigma, recovery, substance use disorder. We talk about policies. We talk about the resources that are available. But this training today is so important because it goes deeper into all of the policies. It gives you the why and it gives you the how. And we try to offer these types of trainings to our employers here in Michigan because we do recognize that there is more conversations to be had that really need to dive deeper into the needs of the employer. And that in turn obviously helps our employees. As I mentioned, there's a lot of us that are here from other states, and a lot of people are represented in these purple states that you see on the right that are all doing this work. May not do it the exact same way that Michigan does, but we are really working together to learn from one another about the needs of our employers, how we can best support them, and who in turn can support the employees that they are employing. And so there's a lot of great people who are doing this work. If you are from a different state and you want to learn more, please seek and really try to find that employer in your neck of the woods. There's also the National Recovery Friendly Workplace Institute. I know that we have representation here today, and they are a part of, we've talked about this policy workshop with them in preparation. And again, we're all talking and learning from one another and really trying to support each other through our quest to really work with employers. Um, and then just really quick, we have those designated employers. This is a lot of the folks who have gone through the journey. MPHI, we just completed ours as well. We've gone through this journey, but all of these other organizations have also become designated as a recovery-friendly workplace and have done the hard work to really find out how can we support our staff. So we're going to turn this over, and I'm really excited because we're so lucky to have Joe McGuire, who is here today, who's going to really lead this discussion. That was a very quick overview of what we're doing. But like I said, there's so much more to talk about. And Joe is going to give us that in-depth overview over a mini series of 3 days. This is day one, really the why workplaces policies matter. Joe is the executive director of National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association, which is the largest membership organization for those operating in the workplace drug testing space. She has lent her expertise to the Colorado Governor's Task Force to regulate Amendment 64, the United Nations General Assembly on the World Drug Agreements, and the 68th session of the Commission of Narcotic Drugs, the Community Alliance for Drug-Free Use Science Team, the Recovery Ready Workplace Institute's Employment Council, so much more. And I know she's a very, very busy person. So we are very, very grateful for all of her expertise and everything that she is going to share with you today. And Joe, I would love it if you would take over. I'm going to stop
Sure.
sharing here and
Great.
turn it
Let's
over
see
to
if you
you.
can see my screen.
I
Just
can.
okay, let me start the slideshow and just make sure we've got the correct view there so that you can all see it. Are you getting the presenter notes or are you getting the slides?
I see the slides. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Nikki, for that introduction. I often tell people just go blah blah blah, Joe. Um, there's a lot there, but some of those things just only matter and are important because I sometimes feel like who is this lady who gets up and talks to us about marijuana and what does she know? So it has been a long journey in my career. I never meant to become an expert on this stuff. Is not what I necessarily thought I would be when I grew up. But I'm going to tell you something. I find it fascinating. I love the work, and I'm so happy to not only be able to be here and share with you all today, but also to have found a place to engage with recovery friendly workplace policies because that has been my heart from the beginning of my time in the drug and alcohol testing industry. And when I discovered the initiatives that were really, had originated out of New Hampshire and were spreading across the country, I really felt like, oh my goodness, this is like, where my heart is taking me and my calling for sort of a purpose in all of the policy work that I've been doing for many years. So I'm very excited about this, and I hope you all are too. So, really quickly, I just want to say, Nikki did mention a minute about Indesa. We do have over 5,000 members in the drug testing space, but that does include employers, the labs, the third-party administrators that run the random testing programs, the medical review officers, the substance abuse professionals, everybody that's involved. We do advocate for safety and recovery-ready workplaces, and we're so happy to have a very big voice there. And we're always happy to be a resource for policy support. So this is a three-part series, and I hope you plan on joining us for the entire ride. For today, we're going to lay a foundation. I want to give you a brief history of workplace policies because the whole context of today is why the policies matter. And I really can't impart that fully to you without kind of giving you just a little bit of an idea of how we got here. And then we'll start really cooking on, why we need a good policy and how we lay that foundation. We're going to talk a little bit about the changing culture in the labor landscape, which is impacting, I'm sure, why every one of you are here today, where we are right now in policy approaches. We're going to have to sprinkle in some of those state and federal considerations because they really matter. And then I'm going to briefly talk about some of the earmarks of a good policy that lend to our why. But next time, those topics are ones that we'll start really delving deeper into and get into them with some depth. So just a very brief history of workplace drug testing here. And I find this really fascinating. I was asked to put this presentation together a while ago, and I guess in the recent past, for the first time about a year and a half ago or so, I started working on this, and I learned a lot. And I thought, gosh, this is really super interesting. I also want to say we're going to try to have time for some Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, you can type them in the chat, but you can also write them down and we'll try to get to all of them at the end as well. So don't hesitate to put your questions out there. So I have put this story on the slide here, the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. This tragedy in the United States was like a culminating event that really solidified labor unions in the US. When the Industrial Revolution happened, and of course lent to tremendous success in the United States, especially on the Eastern Seaboard. And we saw a lot of factory work and we saw a lot of manufacturing come into play. Along with that, just from a long history in any type of an industrial culture, there were many abuses in the workplace, anything from child labor to poor houses often used people that were in poverty that had to work off debts. Some of those were considered to be almost like prison environments, where if you were in and of course this goes back to Europe and our roots over there. If you were in like a debtor's prison and you had to work off your debt before you could have your freedom, those conditions could be pretty deplorable. And then we had bond servants and all kinds of things where people were earning their freedom. So things were not always laid out in a way that was equitable to the worker, right? And it's always been about produce more in a short amount of time, get it done faster, and keep that book going. Well, in this particular situation, what is a triangle shirtwaist? It is that blousey little thing you see there that women were wearing at the time, very popular, very stylish. And the mail order catalog had really come into popularity. And so as women from all around the country ordered their triangle shirtwaists, the company was pressured to do more and to do it more quickly. But ultimately, of course, a lot of factors went into play here, but I think we can all agree there's some greed there that played into this. Um, Women were put into these situations to factory situation to sew these shirts or blouses, and the doors were chained shut so that they could not exit before a quota was met. It was just a horrible, inhumane way of treating the women that worked there, but also about control, et cetera, et cetera. Well, a fire broke out and lives were lost. It was a horrible tragedy. 154 killed in the skyscraper factory fire. And that's not even including all of those who were injured and maimed and et cetera. So, as a result of that tragedy, that is when lawmakers, policymakers really stepped in and said, you cannot do these things. These are not safe. And hours were established and standards were established. And we saw labor unions really come into play in all facets and go, well, we're going to prevent this from happening. in these other industries as well. And that led slowly, it took a few decades, but those ideologies of protecting the worker slowly led to the creation of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act in 1970. So you can see there were several decades in the middle there. Remember, we had two great wars in between. So there were things that happened, right? But when OSHA was formed, then we come into mandates, right? And federal mandates and OSHA inspections and all of that. So it significantly reduce workplace fatalities, injuries, and illnesses. Now, one thing that I want to draw a comparison um, for you in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you a lot today about protecting the workplace. I'm going to talk to you a lot today about how not to get sued and lose. And I'm going to repeat that several times. But ultimately, while I'm talking to you about your own best interests, I also want to lay the foundational principle that OSHA and workplace policies and labor unions and all these things were formed to protect the worker. And ultimately, with recovery friendly workplace, it is about the worker. It is about the people. It is about the human beings. So I don't want you to walk away with the idea that I'm coming from, recovery friendly workplace is the way to protect yourself as the company. I mean, in some ways that is a benefit, but ultimately we've got to take our humanity back to square one and say, let's treat people like people. So these things kind of work in tandem, and I didn't want that to get lost, so I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that. So OSHA is formed in the 70s, and then what happens? We're in the Vietnam era. The Vietnam era really sparked a huge drug epidemic in the U.S. when our military came back home, matriculated into civilian jobs. The opium pipelines, the drugs really started flowing into the U.S. at that point, and we really started seeing an increase of drug use in the workplace in the 70s and leading into the 80s. And that resulted in several tragedies. These are just a few. These are not definitive of all of the tragedies that were occurring. I was reading some historical documents on the beginnings of workplace drug testing a few weeks ago, preparing for some testimony that I gave before the Drug Enforcement Administration. And I'm telling you, we could do 10 slides with as many tragedies here and just keep them going of trucking crashes and transit crashes and all kinds of things that were happening through particularly the mid 70s to the early 80s where lives were lost repeatedly. But these particular incidents here made headlines because of the federal transportation aspect and the involvement of specific substances. The one that really kind of captured the attention of the nation, I mean, Exxon Valdez was huge. The captain was operating under the influence of alcohol. But the Chase, Maryland train collision in January of 1987, look at the date, January 4th. That occurred as people were traveling home from the Christmas holidays in the DC area, traveling home to Maryland. There were many college students, there were many families that were returning from vacations and such. And the operator of that train and his brakeman, as well as several other operators on the train, were using cannabis, were using marijuana while en route on their train. They were running light, which means they didn't have cargo. They missed multiple signals to change track, to divert, and signals that they were going to crash with a passenger train. They missed all of them. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. And at the time that this crash happened, we had basically three major networks in PBS, right? It was on the news morning, noon, and night. That's how we started off our new year. I remember this so vividly as a young woman, home from college break myself. and had not yet returned to school. And we were watching these rescues in the night in the freezing cold air. But this incident right here is what triggered the next series of events. It was kind of like the final linchpin for the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act of 1991. President Ronald Reagan signed this act. Basically, drug testing had started in a multitude of transportation modes and different forms and fashions. Um, Ironically, a lot of the trade unions were fighting against the drug testing, saying it violated civilian rights, private rights. So there was a lot of infighting. There was a lot of attorney representation going back and forth. But when the Chase, Maryland train crash happened by executive order, Ronald Reagan signed an executive order and said, enough is enough. Drug testing will happen in all federal transportation programs, period, end of subject. So that was then implemented and ratified. We know it as OTEDA today in our industry. And then we also saw that coincide with around the same time of the Safe and Drug-Free Workplace Act that required federal contractors and grantees to certify that they would provide drug-free workplaces as a condition of receiving federal funding. So all of those things kind of tied in about the same time and coincided. So when Safe and Drug-Free Workplace Act was put into place, it was mandated, it's federal rule, but they could only enforce it with those who received federal money. They couldn't enforce it nationally. But many workplaces did lose cases, and employees lost cases against workplaces, et cetera, where the Safe and Drug-Free Workplace Act was considered a preeminent law. So it's just a little bit of interesting there. We won't get into all of those details, but drug testing was required for federal workplaces. It's not always enforced necessarily, but it is required. So you definitely have to sign a piece of paper that you do it, but it's not like they're going to usually come behind and audit you. But if something bad happens and you don't have your program in place, then you're in big trouble. The model drug-free workplace policies became standard across the US. So this was something that was highly adopted. Many states created their own model programs. One that I can think of off the top of my head is Florida. Florida really took this very seriously, created and implemented their own model. There's a lot of incentives for workplaces in Florida that follow that practice. So this became standardized. So even though this was required for federal workplaces and federal grantees, the non-federal workplace began to model it. And that is really important because this is going to be a theme. And then, of course, some unions even began to adopt and require drug-free workplace policies. So once the then DOT model of testing, what is that? That's the U.S. Department of Transportation, from the train crashes, the all of the things I just showed you, the aircraft carrier and all of that. Those requirements for drug testing in the federal program were mainly compartmentalized with the U.S. Department of Transportation. Once that the US DOT testing program was implemented and became codified, then we saw the non-DOT workforce create lookalike policies. Now, right here is where I get into using a little bit of lingo, and I don't want everybody to go, okay, she suddenly started throwing acronyms at us. What in the world does that mean? Because I know a lot of you are from all different types of workplaces. So kind of jargon in the workplace drug and alcohol testing policy realm is DOT, non-DOT, and it basically means federal and non-federal. And it's anyone who falls under the requirements to be tested in the U.S. Department of Transportation, DOT, they sort of operate in their own little universe. There's rules, regs. They're very regimented, extremely outlined. They've got 35 years of history. They hold up in court. They're preeminent over state laws. The DOT testing program is a model throughout the world. Other countries model it. There's over 20 states that require employers to follow that testing plan or testing model. It's the gold standard. And then if you're not in the US Department of Transportation bubble, that's just everyone else. Construction, mining, oil and gas manufacturing, bakeries, mechanics, you name it. Everyone else is in the non-DOT world, which is like 90% of the US workforce. But you, whether you know it or not, you are impacted every day by that DOT testing model. So I will use that language a little bit in our time that we have together, but I'll try to clarify and make sure I'm not losing anybody. If you have any questions on that, let me know. But when the DOT model was put in place and then the non-DOT workforce, the rest of the world, created their lookalike policies, zero tolerance became the norm at that time. Really kind of hitting about, I'd say 1995 is when it really hit its stride. I want to say from like 1995 to probably about 2010 or so. So for a good 15 years there, we could say maybe 20 years if you have a little, dribble on either end there. Um, Zero tolerance was just without question kind of common practice. Um, and then we started seeing workers' compensation carriers give discounts for post-accident drug tests. Many states still offer those programs. And then we started seeing statistics and data gathering through the Department of Labor showing drastic reductions in recordable drug-related incidents. Those state departments of labor really used to track that data very, very, very closely. That has waned over the last decade. But we used to be able to see accidents and injuries caused by not only industry type, like Nikki showed us on some of the data just a little bit ago, but we would also see it broken down into drug categories, polydrug categories, et cetera. They're really not doing that as much these days, but we used to track it very, very closely. So I have some slides kind of sprinkled throughout here that are just some food for thought. If we were together in a room and hanging out and talking, we would use these as discussion questions. But just some things to think about. If you're planning on going through the 3-day policy workshop with me, I would like for you to jot some of these questions down for you to just thoughtfully consider either yourself or with your team as we work through policy items. What was what was driving the pivot towards safe and drug-free work environments? And why did non-federal workplaces follow that model? Something to really think about and ask ourselves just based on what you've seen so far. So now we've come to this environment in really the early 90s where workplace policies really start taking shape, and we're starting to see practical approaches to a national drug problem. And so, bear with me here because you might think I'm taking you down one path and then I'll do a little bait and switch on you. All right, so 49 CFR Part 40 is the policy requirement for that U.S. Department of Transportation drug testing. It does require pre-employment, post-accident, random, reasonable suspicion testing. When we get into the components of a policy, we're going to talk about all of those things in depth. Violations do require an evaluation by a substance abuse professional, someone that must be licensed in their state as a professional, and then they must complete a return to duty and a follow-up testing program in order to maintain their status in that Department of Transportation position. And these are safety sensitive positions, every last one of them. Return to duty and follow-up testing must occur whether or not the employer retains the employee if they want to stay in that position. So a pilot, a truck driver, etc., they must complete that program. Even if the company fires them, they want to work for another company in that same position, they have to complete this program. So I want to just kind of just take a deep breath here and have everybody really understand that the intent here was not to terminate everyone who had a drug test violation. It was supposed to be a pathway to recovery. That is how 49 Part 40 was written in the late 80s. That's how it was written. And then somehow we really came into this zero tolerance culture. What happened? So if recovery was the intent, why did DOT allow the option of employee termination? Because right now, like I believe in pretty much every major airline in the US, it's it can be immediate termination for a drug test violation with few exceptions. Sometimes they require you to go through a program and then you can be eligible for hiring at a later date or whatnot, but high zero tolerance, even in the DOT program. So, how did termination become the norm when the pathway was written for recovery? Really interesting to look at that history. But ultimately, an answer that we find there is that the federal government is not allowed to dictate employer policies on retention and termination. They can't do it. They can make this suggestion and say, okay, you have to follow all of this parts of the policy, but when it gets right up into how you operate your business, we can't tell you how to operate your business. So we can't tell you to keep these people. That is a choice that you can make yourself, right? So they can encourage return to duty and follow up, but they can't mandate it. So DOT is silent on the employment consequences, and they're also silent on who pays the cost for return to duty and follow up testing. Now, I'll tell you, there are a lot of companies in the DOT bubble that if you have a drug violation, they will pay for your return to duty test. They'll pay for your follow-up program. They will retain you as long as you're staying with your substance abuse professional ordered testing plan. And it's on the company because they see the value of retaining those people, and they have second chance policies. There are definitely companies out there that do that. Is it the majority? Sadly, it is not. Um, but we do see that the outline is there. Okay, the outline, the ideology, and the pathway is there. So it is up to the employer then how they choose to treat that policy. Now, again, the non-DOT world, all of the rest of us tended to follow those pathways of zero tolerance, and most policies that I've seen in the regular workplace don't even offer an option for return to duty and follow up, and have never heard of it. And it's much to my chagrin because I do think it's a beautiful thing. But lessons that we learned in this era, speaking pragmatically only, okay, zero tolerance worked. It worked. Why? Because we just said we have a raging problem of pervasive drug use in the community, and we just say nope, and then we don't attract those people. And so, out of sight, out of mind, we don't have to worry about it. And that doesn't happen here. How often have I heard that, right? When I was very first getting involved in writing policies and just on that pathway, I've always been fairly involved in my local community. And I was at a women's chamber event, and I was talking to a woman next to me, telling her what I did. And she was telling me she had converted her home in an older part of our community into an Airbnb. And I asked her if she perhaps had a drug and alcohol testing policy, and she said, no, I don't need anything like that. It was like this Victorian home, and it was broken down into almost like little hotel room kind of things. And she had staff that maintained it and did cooking and cleaning and all of that. And she said, no, I don't need a drug and alcohol policy. I only hire people that I know, or people that know the people that I hire, and whatever have you. And so she said, I don't need a policy like that. And I said, well, if you ever do, just let me know. And she said, well, what do you think the criteria is for having a policy? And I said, when you hire one person, you need a policy because you just never know what can happen. And she kind of laughed at me. And she said, well, isn't that convenient for you? And I get that a lot. A lot of people think that all we do in this industry is try to make money off folks. And really the heart is for safety. But at the end of the day, took about 3 months, and she called me one day in a panic. She had a housekeeper that was under the influence, creating havoc, scaring guests, behaving in an unsafe manner. And she said, I want you to get down here with one of your drug tests. We're going to drug test her. And I said, Shirley, did you put a drug and alcohol testing policy in place? And she said, no, 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 I don't have time for that. And I said, do not ever test anyone without a policy. That cannot happen. I will not come. You must get a policy in place. I'm happy to help you, but you're going to have to get that policy, notify your employees. Once they are notified and they agree in writing that they've seen that policy, then we can conduct the test. That's not going to happen today. How can I help you write the policy? And she said, oh, I'm a retired paralegal. I'll write it myself. So she did, and she sent it to me, and I said, well, it's okay. Let's go with that. And then again, she did not terminate the employee, which I live in Colorado. It's a right to work state. She certainly could have fired that employee for her behavior, but she did not want to do that. And so took I don't know, a month, 6 weeks or something went by, and we have the same exact behavior repeating itself. She asked me to come down, do the drug test. And so then at that point, it was okay to do the test. But one of the things that I saw there is that even the smallest of small business owners, the whole mindset is, this doesn't touch me. This is not, in my realm. I don't have to worry about this because I know everyone, or I really grilled them on the interview or whatever. And the reality of it is that substance use, substance abuse, substance use disorder can cycle through, can present itself, can become part of our environment at any time with anyone. And so it's better to have these things in place up front so that we can deal with them properly when the time comes, rather than reacting and panicking. And there's a little more to that story, but we've got a lot to talk about, so I won't get into the rest of it. But um, the zero tolerance issue was seen as a quick and easy path to elimination. It appeared to be cost savings. It sent a clear public message. It definitely created an environment, and it did create a particular internal company morale. And so, again, pragmatically, this worked for a very long time. So, food for thought here: what made or makes employers feel super good about zero tolerance policies, right? It kind of makes us feel safe. It insulates us from dealing with a problem, from facing a problem, from looking at what is right around us, next door to us. And I myself have to say that I was writing zero tolerance policies for workplaces while my own son was struggling massively with his addiction in his teen years. And I was an employee who was being impacted by substance use disorder in my own home. And a lot of signs and symptoms there for me, going through the stressors of that situation, in a very close proximity. And so, I have to say, I probably had a lot of blinders on myself while I was writing those policies as to how that would even impact him in his own future. So the second part of this is, how did drug testing become the hammer of enforcement? Because that's really what happened. We saw, and still do see, a lot of abuses of this particular part of the policy, especially when folks want to eliminate a problem, get rid of someone that they feel is a problem. And I think it's even used sometimes whether or not that person actually consumes drugs or alcohol. Maybe there's a suspicion that they do, but I think I've seen um, just dozens, if not hundreds of cases, because you never know all the motives, where employers have tried to set people up. I remember very specifically an employer who called me up and said, I'm sending someone in for a random drug test today on Friday. And I said, okay, great. And I was responsible for giving her a random drug test every a quarter, and it was her prerogative on which day she wanted them to come in that quarter, and she had to spread them out over a 90-day period. And she said, today is this person's turn. Great. She came in, she did the drug test. That afternoon, that employer called me back and said, hey, I know she just came in and did her drug test. I actually want you to throw the specimen in the trash, and on Monday I'm going to send her back in because I think she'll use drugs over the weekend. And I want you to test her on Monday and send that specimen to the lab so we can catch her. Now, I want you all to know that was a Department of Transportation drug test that we had done, so it was safety sensitive. And I said, no, ma'am, I will not be doing that. That is not only against the rules, it's unethical. You never throw away a DOT drug collection. I won't be party to this. She was really trying to set her up to make sure that she failed so that she could eliminate her. For whatever that motivation was, I don't know. But at the end of the day, she fired me as her drug test collector because I wouldn't play that game. And I was perfectly fine with that because we don't use this to abuse people. We don't use this to discriminate and hurt people or cause them harm. This is a tool that helps us keep safe work environments. So, but that is something that we have seen in our culture. I guess anything can be used and abused, and this is one of those that's just kind of is an easy thing to do. So now we're in a changing landscape. So what does that mean? Well, zero tolerance policies must allow for an unlimited supply of labor, which we do not have any longer. We have a lack of qualified employees. We have just a lack of people in general for a variety of reasons. We've grown industry beyond our population point. And so a lot of times I hear people go, I don't know why lazy people won't come in and apply for jobs. We have open jobs and nobody applies. There's a lack of people for all of those jobs. And it's not always about people are lazy. It's about the fact that we have more jobs than people. So we also have cost of employee turnover is a factor, of course. We have some unintended consequences going on here where employees fear seeking help. Those who have substance use disorders, they know that if they self-report, it could end their job. So zero tolerance policies do contribute to a culture of secrecy for those who do develop problems. And that can happen as adults and can happen later in life, especially with people who get injuries and get prescribed opiates and become dependent. It can happen at any time. So it's not just the young person or the person that comes in with a known, diagnosable disease. This can develop at any point. We've also seen that reporting impairment by fellow coworkers can be a dangerous thing. Sometimes it's helpful, but it can also be retributionary. So we try to sort of bank that down. And all of these things create safety concerns. So we've just had a multitude of problems. And then, as Nikki did refer to at the very beginning, we also see that the average cost of employee turnover is significant, especially to the small business. So the average cost, excuse me, of employee turnover can be half to two times the departing employee's annual salary in direct and indirect costs. So the zero tolerance policies, while we have had in our minds, this saves us money, it saves us from a problem, it helps us just to not deal with that nasty drug problem over there. What we don't realize is that we've created costs on the back end by a high employee turnover. And now we're desperate to find the labor, which is where we find ourselves today, specifically in the service economy. So we've seen labor jobs shift to other countries. Technology advancements have created a different set of goals. We just have labor shortages for a lot of different reasons, but all of these things have created a perfect storm. And then you add into the mix changing laws pertaining to drug legalization. So whether it's medical marijuana or adult use marijuana, whatever that shift has been state to state. Now, of course, we're looking at some federal changes. Whatever those laws have been, those have definitely impacted not only employers' rights to drug-free workplace policies and practices, and I'm going to show you some of those, but this has become a personal rights issue for the worker. So what does that mean when you add that into the mix? And then testing for cannabis can be complicated and create some confusion. We'll get to that in, I believe, our next segment. We're going to dig down into that a little bit. And then we can have some even greater shortages of potential candidates in the workplace. So, what we've seen in that culture as a result of changing laws is it's become less and less popular for employers to even test. We've seen a lot of media pieces sort of flooding the internet that drug testing is discriminatory, that big companies are dropping it because it's discriminatory. None of that is based on science or data. Those are presumptions. But it's the pervasive I guess, lore that's out there. And so when people believe it's true, they go, ooh, this is not really the cool thing to do at the moment. What does that do to a safety program? And the little graphic on the bottom right of your screen, I wanted you to see that because I found it to be really interesting. And I love using this slide, and I've had it for many, many years. But in 2012, the voting year, the election year 2012, that was the year that Colorado, Washington, and Oregon moved from a medical marijuana system to a recreational or adult use marijuana program. Oregon and Washington did some smaller state initiatives, and they put those voter initiatives in certain places in their state regs that were less dramatic than Colorado. Colorado got the publicity worldwide because we changed our state constitution on this, and so we embedded it into our state constitution. That's why you always hear about Colorado model all the time. Um, so it was very interesting because the voters voted on that act in 2012 November. And then on January 1st, 2013, personal use and personal home grow became legal. On January 1st, 2013, the recreational market as we know it, with like the recreational commercialization, like store, I don't want to say dispensary. The dispensary model is really in the medical marijuana category, but really the cannabis shops, okay, those did not open their doors until January of 2014, because we had a year gap before all of that was figured out, and those stores opened in January 2014. Why am I telling you that? Because this little graph down here shows you that in from 2012, the year we voted on that, to 2013, according to Quest Diagnostics Drug Test Index, which is where this slide comes from, the national average of cannabis use for the adult worker was at 6%. Colorado and Washington were both at that national average of 6% before this data year. And then in the year that we made personal use legal, our workplace positivity for marijuana on drug tests jumped to 20%, and Washington went up to 24%. So we tripled the national average, and Washington quadrupled the national average in 1 year. Why do I put that slide up there? Because it shows you, I'm going to go back one, it shows you that when the laws changed, the employee's mindset went to a certain place and said, it's our time, right? And so we started seeing that major culture shift in 2013. So, just the food for thought here is, how has marijuana legalization shifted the conversation toward adopting second chance policies in the workplace? Because now in Colorado, it became an employee's constitutional right to use recreational marijuana. Where does that intersect with the employer's right to the drug-free workplace? And so I saw that this storm was brewing and coming, and that's kind of where I went in my career. So are these current policies working successfully? Where are we right now? And what does all of this mean? Well, we definitely know that more employers are removing THC from the drug test than ever before, or just simply dropping the drug test altogether. We're seeing that just across the nation in massive amounts, to the point where the Quest Diagnostics Drug Test Index, which has been going on for, I think, 35 years or longer, actually now is showing a decline in marijuana positivity. But on their slides, they say, and in their data, they say that the drop isn't in employee use, the drop is in the testing. So the testing numbers are going down. Therefore, the numbers of positivity we have are shrinking because the volume of testing for cannabis just isn't there anymore. So that's an interesting thing. So we've seen a post-pandemic cascade because of the great resignation, and employers feel desperate to make concessions to get people to come to and stay in the workplace. Also, the changing laws are complicated and confusing, and a lot of employers just say, forget it, we're not going to do it. We don't want to get sued. There's that fear of legal consequence. One of the things that I want to stress here is employers don't get sued nearly as often as they think they will. So the amount of times that happens is actually minuscule compared to the fear that we have over it happening. And also, a lot of states protect employers' rights, including Colorado. We did not change a single right for employers in our state, which are very strong here in the state of Colorado. So, but employers just went, oh God, they're going to sue me, and started just dropping the drug test. And nope, 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 we don't want to know about it, which can create other problems on the back end for safety. But even DOT has seen increased violations, which is quite interesting. So, removing the workplace drug test, it may not be the thing that brings balance to those policies because of increased risk over safety concerns. And we'll get into that in another presentation. But also, I'm going to talk to you for a lot of the rest of our time together today about the culture. What is the culture that you are creating in your workplace? I was doing this policy workshop live for a group of employers in Reno, Nevada, a few years ago. And I was trying to stress the culture that you're creating. And we were in this really nice room for our presentation, and we had a brand new smart board and access to the internet, and everything was really fun. So as just like a I guess on a lark, really, I said, I want to talk to you about your culture. Let's just type into Google, are there drug friendly jobs that I can get in Reno, Nevada? We're standing in Reno. And so I typed that into Google, and I got jobs to careers popped up. And as you can see in the red circle, it said there's 337 no drug test jobs in Reno, Nevada. And then it lists them by industry type. And you can see that some of them even have company names on there. I mean, Walmart and Alorica are called out right there by their brand name, which is interesting. But as I brought that up, and I said, you have to understand that people will seek this. And also, when I did the search, I mean, the pages, I think there was 12,000 hits, and you could see it was a top search, and the employers in the room were just like shocked. And so there was a guy sitting right in front of me, and he said, hey, I'm in manufacturing. Can you click on that one? I want to see what it says. Because if you can see on your screen, it tells you how many jobs in each category, or how many companies in each category are available there. So I clicked on manufacturing because he said, that's my industry. And then his company was number two. And he goes, click on my company. I want to see how they gauge that. And so I clicked on it, and basically what it is, it's either current employees or prospective employees who are commenting and saying they don't drug test you, they don't care, they're cool with it, they look the other way. I smoke pot every day, or I do this, or I do that. I'm even allowed to drive the company delivery truck. Nobody ever checks. And so it was the people in the community, the employees, giving feedback to demonstrate how drug friendly these workplaces are. And this man was like gasping for air. He's like, none of that is true. We don't allow that. We don't look the other way. We don't, turn a blind eye. And I said, do you have a random testing program? And he's like, no. I said, do you have a pre-employment testing program? No. And I said, then the message that you're sending, the culture that you're creating by not minding the store at all, is that it's okay. And he goes, well, I want you to click on the first one that showed up. That's my competitor. I clicked on the first company, and the very first comment that had been typed in by an employee using a synonym as a name, whatever, says, we deal drugs right off the back dock and nobody cares. There's cameras on us and they never say anything. And he said, that is my competitor, but that's also my buddy. And I know he would be mortified. And I'm like, well, invite him to come to the next segment, because what I'm trying to say to you is intentionally or unintentionally, we create a culture with our policies, and it's so important that we're aware. And now, also, I want to say this job board doesn't exist anymore, but you can find this information on Reddit. You can find it out there on the internet. There are plenty of places where you can find it because people talk, and there's an underbelly of the community there that a lot of us aren't aware of. So over the past maybe 5 to 6, 7 years here, as we've had more permissive policy decisions where we've dropped the drug test, we're seeing that, first of all, individuals that say they use cannabis at work, 53 say we use daily or before going to work, 86 consume by smoking or vaping, 48 use on the job during a break or while working. We've seen a high number of violations in the FMCSA trucking industry, which is shocking. I mean, that yellow line you see up there on the top right, that is commercial motor vehicle trucking, okay, where there's a zero tolerance policy, supposedly. We've seen drug test positivity, the highest in 2 decades. I have some graphs there. The red box in 2021, according to the National Safety Council, 53% of employers who dropped cannabis testing said they had increased safety incidents and decreased performance. And then survey data shows more employees dropping THC from the test, and federal programs may be at risk, even though costs pertaining to workplace incidents have increased. It seems to me that employers are willing to accept that liability, which is, I think we don't understand the cost on both sides of this. So, how do we do this in a balanced way? How do we find a happy medium? Where is that happy place that we can go? I want you to understand that the workplace policy determines what happens in court when something goes wrong. That's why that document is there. That document is not there to force a certain behavior from your employees. It's not there I mean, yes, there's guidelines and yes, all of that. But at the end of the day, as we go through policies, this is, can you defend this decision in court and how? And that's what it boils down to. Your policy must be current. If it's 10 years old and you've never revisited it, you're going to get hurt if you end up in a court case. And never say never. It must be clear and comprehensive. You must follow what the policy says. You cannot go off book. I'm going to repeat that many, many times over the next 2 periods. You just don't go off book. You do what the policy says. And if you have to make an exception for some weird reason, document, because you must be prepared to defend that in court. And then you also must remind employees about their responsibility to follow the policy on a regular basis. And you must be able to prove that you have done so in order for this policy to stand up in court every single time. It has become complex. I don't want to pretend like it's not. We've got court cases, which we're going to look at. We have state laws. We have the marijuana issue, workers' comp. Now we're throwing ADA into the mix, especially with marijuana becoming a Schedule III drug. OSHA is still a factor. And then if you are involved in unions or anything like that, all of these things can be a factor here. So this is why I often say, and I'm kind of laughing at myself. I had a slide at the very beginning and I think I accidentally deleted it somehow. I am not a lawyer. So I will advise you to consult your attorney. I'm not giving you legal advice. I'm giving you sound educational, foundational education. But we'll talk about how to talk to your attorney about these things. So your policy is your company's rule of practice. It provides clarity of expectations, consequences for violations. And we're going to talk a lot about that too. And I'm going to give you some hints and tips on about consequences for violations. It creates accountability and it addresses issues pertaining to liability. Now, foundationally, I want you to understand that historically, for 2 decades, courts ruled in favor of the employers almost without even blinking an eye. And here are just a few of those that came down. You can take a screenshot, you can look them up. They're very interesting cases. I'm not going to dig into every one of them today, but I do want to say the Coates versus Dish Network case, which I believe the ruling on that was either 2013 or 2014, That was a landmark case that the cannabis industry expected to win in Colorado post medical marijuana because Coates was a medical marijuana patient. He I believe had MS. He worked from home. He was a remote worker. He claims the company knew that he was a medical marijuana patient for his MS. They kind of seemed to dispute that, but he came up in a random drug test pool. He failed the drug test and he was fired for violating the policy. When they went to court, I mean, he felt like he had a very strong case. And the Colorado Supreme Court ruled against him and said, this was the policy. You knew it. There's nothing in writing that says otherwise. They followed the policy to the letter of the law. And without apology, he lost that case. So that was, again, I think it was 13 or 14 when that happened because it was right around the time that we had just switched over to recreational marijuana. Then what happened? 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. All of a sudden, we start seeing in every single one of these cases where the courts ruled in favor of the employee. And there are very specific reasons why in almost every one of these cases, the state laws had changed and the employers failed to acknowledge that. And I can tell you all of these stories. Some of them are extremely interesting. But what I will do is just give you a brief synopsis is that the cases don't establish a nationwide right for an employee to use cannabis without consequences. That is not what happened. What happened here is that the employers failed to have proper policies that were compliant with their state laws and to follow them. So the positive test did not establish workplace impairment where required in Whitmire. That was New Jersey. New Jersey made that a requirement and they just blew it off and lost their case. Disability accommodations could not be rejected categorically. That's 3 cases, and Barbudo is considered something that is now replicated in other states. State medical cannabis law created an enforceable employment right in Palmitter. Employer failed to follow state-based drug testing restrictions in Dix. And the last one, states expressly prohibited discrimination based on cardholder status. That's in almost every state that has any form of legal marijuana. Callahan and Knopfsinger won on those because once they notified their employer, hey, just so you know, I have a medical marijuana card, they were terminated for simply holding the card. That's discrimination. We will circle back to those pieces of policy when we get into the policy writing part. But this is why we must be compliant with state laws. Right now, there are currently no states that specifically prohibit private employers from screening for marijuana, but there are 10 states that limit the action that they can take, and a few states prohibit an employer from discriminating against someone simply because of their status. There are some state laws that I want you to note. If you are coming to this workshop from these specific states, you need to know what your state law says before you do any policy changes because you must be compliant with that state law. New Jersey, Arkansas, Oklahoma, New York has labor law, Nevada, California, Minnesota, and Washington. At this point, and this presentation is being based in Michigan, so I pulled up Michigan, but I know it doesn't apply to many of you. But this is an interesting study right here that I just want to mention briefly. Michigan imposes few restrictions on private employers, right? So they really did not address any restrictions on employers. Like it's almost like a proceed as you always have. You're fine. There's a few little things in here about state jobs that need to be noted. But then what we're seeing now with the changing status of marijuana going into Schedule 3, some states have Schedule 3 protections if they've opted into that, and then we may have federal Schedule 3. Marijuana will fall into ADA protection status, which is going to be a whole different event. And I'm not going to dwell on this right now. We'll circle back to this later. But there are cases where you must make an attempt to accommodate if you can, if it doesn't hurt your business. That's federal ADA law. You don't have to require healthcare to pay for it or any of that. But what do we have? Michigan ADA law. They have their own disability discrimination statute. And there are certain things that have to be followed in Michigan ADA law, even though employment law has kind of been untouched. In ADA law for Michigan, you have to obtain accommodation requests in writing. You can't disregard oral requests. You could still trigger federal ADA responsibilities. You have to document everything, et cetera. So it protects underlying medical conditions that medical marijuana qualifies for, but not necessarily the medical marijuana use. So there are some exclusions of any legal controlled substances, which marijuana will now not fall into that category. So it can get confusing, and so we have to be sure that this is where we are, staying in the confines. And then if you choose to make a medical marijuana accommodation in your policy, um, I say the best practice is follow EEOC, to look at what the options have been provided, what are best practices, and those are some things you can consider. One thing I will say, and you can be preparing for this as you look at your policy, you must define who is safety sensitive and who is not. This also can qualify for security sensitive, anybody who's handling sensitive data. So you can say safety and security sensitive. EEOC can give you some really great suggestions there for what that can look like, but you need to articulate this on every position description as to why that individual may not operate under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and that's just the era that we're in. If you do choose to make accommodations, be specific, consistent, know that it does not apply to safety sensitive functions, and make sure that you keep detailed documentation of accommodations. So now let's look at earmarks of a good policy. Policy and practice have to work together. If you rework your policy document, I mentioned before, you put it on a shelf, you don't look at it again for 10 years, that's an epic fail. And we just can't have that. So all supervisors must be trained to detect and document signs and symptoms of substance use that could impact safety. And we will delve into that another time, but you need to understand that the practice of carrying out the policy and keeping people safe is just as important as what is on that piece of paper. So I want you to have that in mind and understand that that matters. Remember that we are trying to form a basis here, a checkpoint, if you will, of recovery friendly workplace. So that's something I don't want to get lost in the shuffle. And that these are going to be earmarks that we are working from moving forward. Your workplace drug and alcohol policy creates the culture. It should bring clarity to your position. It should be complete, consistent, and well communicated. For as far as the culture goes, it sets the tone that you want for the company environment. And recovery friendly versus zero tolerance, that's a huge difference. You can say we're zero tolerance for anybody working on the job under the influence, that's fine. Or working under the influence while intoxicated. But what are we going to do with people who have a problem? We want to nurture them to health and wellness. Will that work 100% of the time? You know what? Maybe not. Substance use disorder is a spectrum, right? Many people will return to a baseline of health and wellness, and we celebrate that. You will have some who aren't ready; they're not there yet, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, we're going to make choices that respect people. And what are your company values? We're going to put the company values in the policy as well. So we're going to talk about mission statements next time. Clarity on violations. What are consequences? We're not going to be vague on this. And I'm going to talk about that in depth. Okay. We're going to avoid gaps with the complete policy, but we're also going to leave ourselves some opportunities in there because drugs trend, right? And so I see a lot of people that say, we're going to test for these 8 drugs. And then, a year from now, there's 3 brand new drugs on the market that nobody's ever heard of before. So there's ways that I can help you be flexible as well as complete. All right. And then consistency, you're going to commit to this policy. You're going to follow it every single time, like I mentioned before, so that if you get sued, you don't have an automatic loss in your category because you just went completely off book. So you have to commit. And then communicate. you have to have a plan for communicating this company-wide to every single individual, and you cannot veer from that, but it has to be repeated over and over and over. And I'm going to give you a lot of suggestions for how to do that as well. I do want to say before we move into the next phase of our policy workshop next week, that if you do have DOT employees and non-DOT employees, because most companies that have Department of Transportation workers also have supporting staff that don't qualify as safety sensitive, you must have two separate policies. They cannot be one policy. They have to be two distinctly separate policies. So that is a requirement by U.S. Department of Transportation. So if you fall into that category, you might be looking at two different policies side by side that you're working on. And so I just wanted to note that. And I also want you to note that U.S. Department of Transportation policy is considered a best practice. It is the only rule of law in the U.S., so we refer to a lot because it has evidentiary history and background. It's held up in court. But one thing that I also want to note, and one of the court cases that was on one of my slides previously, Walmart lost a case, a landmark case actually in the Northeast, because in their non-DOT policy, and this was several years ago, but in their non-DOT policy, they just put, we follow the DOT protocols and left it at that. And the judge ruled that is insufficient. You explained nothing, and not everything in DOT applies to your non-DOT, so you don't get away with that. And so, even though this is a great model and we like it and we pull a lot of things from it, it doesn't suffice just to say, boom, we follow the DOT model. So, just warning you against that mistake. I also want to say and get ready for your questions if you have questions for me, because we're almost to the end of today's slides. Your policy is a living, breathing document. Don't be afraid to change it. Don't be afraid to be flexible with it. Review it annually, change it when necessary. Now, I don't recommend that you just be constantly changing it and in flux constantly, because you'll confuse your workforce. You go through it, you make some changes, you need to commit to those changes for a good while. Review it annually to make sure, is this working? Is it not working? How can we make what is not working work, right? So that is the kind of the mindset that I want you to go into it with. But if a law changes, if you found that it's got a mistake in it, change it. Let your employees know, remind them of it, and then do the right thing. So I've seen companies when I did that policy workshop in Reno, Nevada, this gentleman brought his policy to me and he said, me and my partner wrote this in 1972. Can you review it and tell me if there needs to be any changes? It was typed on a typewriter on this really thin piece of typing paper. It could have fallen apart in my hands, and it had like 6 bullet points, and I'm like, oh boy, we have a lot of work to do here. So if your founding document has not been addressed in a while, I'm so glad you're here, because that's not going to fly these days. So don't be afraid to see this as a living, breathing document that we can change. So before our next steps, I've given you a couple of little hints, but I want you to come next time with this in mind. Do not ever, and I hope you haven't ever implemented a drug or alcohol testing program or policy without communicating it to your workforce. They have to know, they have to be informed. I'm going to give you a little bit more background on that, but we don't do surprises on a drug testing program. Now, random drug test is different. They should already know that they're subject to that, but we don't just implement a policy with a surprise and, hey, we decided to do this. Today's your lucky day. That's not how that goes. That's a violation of civil rights. So if this is something that you have not done, we've missed a step, and so I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. We are going to avoid just typing in case by case consequences for violations in our policies. We're going to talk about what consequences are. So if you think you're going to get away with that as a catch-all, you won't get away with it with me. And I'll tell you why. So we'll go through that as well. So be thinking about, what do consequences look like? How do we carry those out, and what does that mean? And that can even be in your whole second chance realm. I just want you to understand that we've got to be very specific. And then one thing that I want you to be really, really keenly aware of is we've got to remove the word impairment as a standard of measurement in every policy that you have, because there is no impairment standard legally. So we're going to replace the word impairment with intoxication or under the influence, unless we're just using it as an adjective. It is not the standard. So we're going to get a little bit more into that, but those are some things that I can have you be thinking about as we're moving into the next phase of our policy workshop. So, Nikki, with that, we can go into questions. I can't see the questions bar as long as I'm sharing the screen. So, do you want me to keep sharing and you tell me the questions, or do you want me to stop sharing my screen and get into the chat with you?
We can definitely stop sharing it, but I did capture the questions. So I'm happy to start kind of reiterating some of the ones that have come up. And I tried to capture when they were happening so that it would give us some context. So going back to the beginning, one of the first questions that I saw when we were speaking about how these policies were started, and one of the questions was about what about government construction contracts? So thinking back to those federal contracts, I think that was where that came from. And so feel free if the person, needs to come off mute and share some more details. But what about
And
government?
I'll make an assumption unless someone wants to jump in, but if you receive federal dollars, so let's say you're working on a federal highway project, in your contract, you are supposed to agree to be and enforce a safe and drug-free workplace. Usually it's a checkbox, and that federal contract usually has a do you abide by federal safe and drug-free workplace programs and protocols, and you check it, and that's the extent of it. So when I said it's like a formality, and they don't come and audit you on it, remember the other piece of what I said. If you end up with, if you're not enforcing that policy and you end up with some type of fatality, accident, injury, where the feds then come in and you're under investigation and they go, you didn't drug test, you didn't pre-employment drug test, you ignored that, they will find you liable and they'll wash their hands of it and walk away without supporting you. So it's almost used like a technicality in a way of think of it as getting out of workers' comp claims. It's kind of used in that way, and I've seen that a lot here where I live with federal contractors in the aerospace program. They've brought me their contracts and said, all we have to do is check this box. Don't we have to write more? They don't require you to write more, but they do hold you to it if you don't do it. So it's become a technicality. It didn't start out that way, but that's kind of how it's used. And if someone wants to do any follow up with me, I'm happy to address it.
Okay, thank you. And then another question we were talking about let's see, do all states require drug testing policies to be approved by their Department of Labor?
No, not all do. There are a couple of states that have that written into law. And I don't know if it's always the Department of Labor, but I believe Georgia is one of those states where you're supposed to submit your policy and have it approved. So this is why it's important to know your state laws. I have some colleagues in my industry who are experts in drug testing state laws. They're wonderful. I can make referrals to you. It is an attorney-based group, and this is like their entire focus of their legal practice. So I can refer you to people who can really dig into those details with you. That is something that I don't take time to dig into. I know some of them off the top of my head, but there are states that do require that. So this is why knowing your state laws is so important.
I might want to follow up on that for Michigan to know for sure, yes or no. I don't think so, but I would like to know for sure. Discussing marijuana, has the testing approach changed to test for current on the job as compared to the historical use, so used in the last weeks?
That's a great question. I will dig into that with you a lot more. I can't remember if it's in segment 2 or 3. We're gonna get into that when you are putting your testing protocols in your policy. It's probably next week, I think. So one of the things that I want everyone to understand is that all testing is presence and system testing, even alcohol, all of it. It just is what it is. We do not have an scientific legal impairment standard in the US for any type of drug use. Alcohol, we legislated an impairment standard out of necessity. And I'm not saying this is a pro or a con. What I am saying to you is that the legal standards for alcohol are different in some states than other states. Not everybody is legally, or not, I shouldn't say that. Not everybody is fully intoxicated as the next person at a certain number, but we implemented a legal standard out of necessity to save lives, and so we follow it. For years, alcohol impairment standards were contested in court, and a lot of those court cases were won by the individual that was operating under the influence because the impairment standard is not fully, completely scientific and applicable to every single person to whom it applies. But our culture shifted and we decided, okay, we're going to accept this no matter what. And it's a line in the sand. All right. We don't have that right now for anything else. Marijuana testing has evolved. Lab-based oral fluid testing is amazing. I'm going to talk to you about that next time. We're going to talk about what it means. It's a shorter window where we have things on the horizon that are shrinking that window. They're wonderful tests. And we're really excited about those tests. We still don't have an impairment standard. And that's something that we grapple with all the time. It's one of the reasons it's been in Schedule 1 for so long is it just operates very differently on a variety of different people. So I will give you some best practices for how to deal with that. And I'll talk to you at length on even how to defend the urinalysis because a lot of what you think you know about it is not necessarily true. But so the answer is a little bit of yes and a little bit of no.
Mhm. A lot more to come for sure. And I know that this is evolving too. So one of the questions was, so once cannabis moves to Schedule 3, employees will be able to request ADA accommodations for cannabis use, which means we have to participate in the interactive process for that, just like any other accommodation. I think you kind of touched on that, but to reiterate, would you like to address that again?
Yes, and I'm hoping by the time we have our third session, we'll know the timeline that the federal government is going to do on Schedule 3, but we do know that they did this, Schedule 3 in the states issue. Not all of the states are choosing to participate in that, so it's going to depend on what your state does. I've heard some states are already opting out of it, and there's reasons why. We could talk about that later if we have time. But ultimately, it is the qualifying conditions that will matter um, in those cases. And they will have to be verified and validated. This won't just be a free for all of medical cards, to my understanding. Um, Again, each state will do what they will do, but we'll dig into that. I'm meeting with a lot of different attorneys. There's a lot of different interpretations and understandings out there of how it's all working. So I'm trying to corral those folks so we can kind of get like some common knowledge of what we think is going to happen. But I also think a lot of that will be determined by court cases. So we'll take that one step at a time.
Sounds good. Thank you. And I don't think I missed anything, but if I did miss a question, feel free to put it back in the chat. We are at 1 o'clock, so I do want to respect everyone's time with that as well. Feel free if you would like to. We have included on the screen the next two shot sessions. So if you're not registered, you can use the QR code. I will send a follow-up email with the link as well, so that people can register online if you haven't already. Joe, thank you so much. This has been so interesting.
Yeah.
A lot of this stuff is like really heavy and it's hard to stay engaged, but you make it very easy to just listen and just be absorbed by this. So thank you so much for everything that you are doing to educate all of us on this and looking forward to next week to keep the conversation going.
Thank you. Looking forward to next week.
Great. Thanks, everyone. we'll touch base soon and let us know if you have any further questions. You can send them to us if you think of them, and maybe we can incorporate that into our future sessions as well. So feel free to do that. I'll send that in the follow-up email as well. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Joe. It was amazing.